Greetings. This is the fourth of several podcasts that will deal with the Civil War historical markers in Indiana. This week we visit Jennings, Laporte, Marion, Montgomery, Noble, and Owen counties. The markers include various Civil War training camps, Indiana's Civil War governor, and some famous generals native to the state. We start in Jennings County. This historic marker in Vernon notes an incident that occurred during Morgan's raid. Title of the marker, Morgan's raid. Location, southwest corner of Courthouse Square, Vernon, Jennings County, Indiana. Marker text. During the Civil War, Confederate General John Hunt Morgan led a raid into southern Indiana, July the 8th through the 13th, 1863. On July 11th, he demanded the surrender of Vernon. Colonel Hugh T. Williams, Indiana Legion, replied that, quote, Morgan must take it by hard fighting, unquote. No major battle occurred, and Morgan's cavalry withdrew towards DuPont in Jefferson County, unquote. As with all Morgan's raid markers, I will include this in the podcast devoted to the raid. The historical marker in Michigan City notes the location of Camp Anderson in Laporte County. Title of the marker, Camp Anderson, location 2404 East Michigan Boulevard at Carroll Street, Michigan City in Laporte County, Indiana. Marker text, one of 3 Civil War training camps in Laporte County. Site is 1/4 mile west, named for Colonel Edward Anderson. Used 1863 to 1864 to train Indiana Union volunteers of the 127th, 128th, and 129th regiments. I will cover these regiments in the podcast that will be deal with the Indiana Civil War regiments later in this series. Marion County, there are several markers in Marion County. This marker, located on Delaware Street in Indianapolis, honors Brigadier General Benjamin Harrison. Title of the marker, Brigadier General William Harrison, 1833 through 1901. Location, President Benjamin Harrison Home, 1230 North Delaware Street, Indianapolis. Text, entered the Union Army as second lieutenant of the 70th Indiana Regiment. He insisted on turning raw recruits into disciplined soldiers. He later was United States Senator from Indiana and the 23rd President of the United States. Benjamin Harrison lived from August the 20th, 1883 until March the 13th, 1901. A native of North Bend, Ohio, Harrison was the second of 8 children born to John Scott Harrison and Elizabeth Ramsey Irwin Harrison. Indiana Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison was his grandfather. Harrison attended a one-room schoolhouse near his home and attended nearby Farmers College for 2 years. After completing 2 years at Farmers College, he transferred to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, from which he graduated in 1852. After graduating from Miami, he studied law as an apprentice at Cincinnati Law Office of Storer and Gwynn. While there, he married Farmers College classmate Carolyn Lavinia Scott, with whom he had 2 children. In 1854, he received a small inheritance and moved to Indianapolis and gained admittance to the bar. He joined the law practice of John H. Ray. He favored the Whig Party and joined the Republican Party in 1856. He gained election as an Indianapolis City Attorney the same year. His elected post as reporter of the Indiana Supreme Court. He also served on the Republican State Committee secretary. The outbreak of the Civil War interrupted his political career. Reluctant to serve as an officer because of his lack of military experience, Harrison requested Governor Oliver P. Morton to find a role for him. At Morton's request, Harrison recruited a regiment. Morton commissioned Harrison as a captain in this regiment, the 70th Indiana. His initial service was guard duty at Louisville, Kentucky. Eventually, the regiment moved to the front lines and fought at the battles of Resaca, Cassville, New Hope Church, Lost Mountain, Kennesaw Mountain, Marietta, Peachtree Creek, and Atlanta. After Sherman began his march to the sea, Harrison's regiment transferred to the west to fight at the Battle of Nashville. During the war, Harrison attained the rank of Brevet Brigadier General. During the war, he was re-elected to his reporter post at the Supreme Court. He mounted unsuccessful campaigns for governor in 1872 and 1876. In the aftermath, Harrison maintained a public exposure by continuing his law practice and serving on various political posts. When the Republicans won the state legislature in 1880, he served in the Senate. They elected him to the Senate. He served in the Senate until 1886, when the Democrats took over the legislature and did not re-elect him. His prominence as a senator created an opportunity for him at the national level. He gained a Republican nomination in 1888, running against Grover Cleveland. Harrison won the electoral vote, but not the popular vote. He served as president for one term. A declining economy in 1892 caused his popularity to decline. He ran again, however. During the election, his wife contracted tuberculosis. His campaign muted to care for his wife. He lost the election and retired to private life. His wife died shortly before the election. Benjamin Harrison died in his Indianapolis home in 1901. He is interred in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. The Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site maintains the Benjamin Harrison home in Indianapolis. For more information about Harrison's life and legacy, visitors may visit the home. For more information, contact Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site, 1230 North Delaware Street, Indianapolis, Indiana. You can phone at 317-631-1888, and it's on the web at benjaminharrisonpresidentialsite.org. This historical marker at the Capitol marks the location of the Civil War Arsenal in Indianapolis. Title of the marker: Civil War Arsenal, 1861 through 1864. Location: Capitol Avenue and Market Street at the east entrance to the State House. Indianapolis, Indiana, Marion County. Marker text: Governor Oliver P. Morton established a state arsenal to supply Indiana's troops with ammunition. First located adjacent to the state capitol, the arsenal was later moved to the present site of Arsenal Technical High School. I've written just a little bit more about this. Congress passed an act on July the 11th, 1862, that established 3 federal arsenals to house and repair weapons and to store munitions. Congress allocated $100,000 for each of the facilities to be built at, quote, in the state of Ohio, at Indianapolis, in the state of Indiana, and on Rock Island, in the state of Illinois, unquote. The Ordnance Department in Washington, D.C. designed all 3 buildings, drawing on existing designs of other arsenals. All 3 buildings were identical except for the local architects chose materials native to the areas in which they were built to construct them. The clock tower held a pulley system used to pull heavy loads up and down the 7-story building. Construction began on the 73-acre site in 1863. The Armory chose a site on Michigan Avenue south of a thick forest. They chose the site because it was close to downtown Indianapolis and did not impose on the city because of its remoteness. Indianapolis architect Isaac Hodgson oversaw the construction under the direction of Captain Thomas J. Treadwell. Treadwell endeavored to use all local materials in its construction. During the final phase, he did have to import brick from Cincinnati. Construction of the building completed in 1865 and served as an Armory arsenal until 1903, when it was sold. Arsenal Technical High School still now occupies the site. Many of the original buildings are still on the site, used by the high school. Visitors may tour the site if they contact the school first to make arrangements. Contact 317-693-5300. Visitors must register first before visiting. The passage through Indianapolis of the Lincoln Funeral Train forms the topic of this marker. Title of the marker: The Lincoln Funeral Train. Location: South Lawn, Indiana State House, 200 West Washington Street, Indianapolis, in Marion County, Indiana. Marker text: Side 1. Assassinated President Abraham Lincoln's funeral was April 19, 1865, at the White House. The funeral train left for Springfield, Illinois on April the 21st, directed by the military. Stops en route allowed mourners to pay homage. In Richmond, Indiana, Governor Oliver P. Morgan boarded the train. The train reached Indianapolis April the 30th at 7 o'clock a.m. Buildings were draped in black. Side 2. In the rain, Lincoln's coffin was escorted along the crowded streets lined with soldiers to the old State House, located here. Soldiers reports say at least 50,000 people viewed Lincoln's open casket in the rotunda. Those streets lit by bonfires and torches, the coffin was returned to Union Depot. Train departed at 12 o'clock a.m. for Michigan City, the last scheduled Indiana stop. I've written just a little bit more about this. Southern sympathizer and actor John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater on April the 15th, 1865. It was just 6 days after General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of the Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The surrender effectively ended the Civil War that had raged across the nation for 4 years. After funeral services in the White House on April the 19th, 1865, and after lying in state in the East Room of the White House on April the 18th, an honor guard transported the casket holding the body to the rotunda of the United States Capitol for a ceremonial service. The body lay in state on April the 20th. At 7 o'clock a.m., an honor guard escorted the president to a waiting funeral train that would transport him to Springfield, Illinois for burial. The funeral process for President Lincoln began at 8 o'clock a.m. with around 10,000 people observing. The route the train would take would mirror the route on which he took his inaugural journey to Washington, D.C. from Springfield, Illinois during his inauguration in 1861. Before reaching Indiana, the train would travel through Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio. The president's son, Todd, who had died in the White House, would accompany him. The president reached the state he spent his boyhood in, crossing the Ohio border into Richmond, Indiana. Indiana Governor Oliver P. Morton got on the train and accompanied the fallen president to Indianapolis, where Lincoln again lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Along the way, the train passed through various Indiana towns, including Centerville, Germantown, Cambridge, Knightstown, and Charlottesville. Church bells tolled and crowds gathered to watch the solemn procession stream by. A heavy rain had accompanied Lincoln along the route. The rain prevented Governor Morton from delivering his public address. At Michigan City, the train delayed while Chicago dignitaries gathered to board the train to accompany the president to Chicago. The train departed Michigan City on May the 1st, 1865. A marker on Alabama Street notes the location of Camp Morton, used both as a training camp and as a prisoner of war camp in Indianapolis. Title of the marker, Camp Morton, 1861 through 1865. Location, 1900 block North Alabama Street, Heron Morton Place Historic Park, Indianapolis in Marion County. Marker text, site selected by Lew Wallace as a training camp for volunteers in the old state fairgrounds in 1861 and named for Governor Oliver P. Morton. Used as a camp for Confederate prisoners 1863 through 1865. Governor Richard Owen Commandant. Brief history. February the 22nd, 1862, the first Confederate prisoner of war camp opened. Confederate troops first fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina on April the 12th, 1861. On April the 14th, 1861, Indiana Governor Oliver Morton offered to raise 10 regiments or 10,000 men in response to President Lincoln's call for troops to put down the Southern Rebellion. Raising this many recruits created the need for a recruiting and training camp. After surveying the land around Indianapolis, the only suitable place found was the land used as the state fairgrounds, established in 1852. Thus, the 36-acre state fairgrounds became a Union Army training camp and recruitment facility. Named Camp Morton in honor of the governor, the camp came under his direct administration. Union victories at Fort Donelson in February 1862 created another need. The Union Army had captured thousands of Confederate prisoners. There was a need to house these prisoners. Union General Henry H. Halleck dispatched a request by telegraph for prisoner of war facilities, and Governor Morton agreed to take up to 3,000 prisoners on February the 17th, 1863. Morton assigned Assistant Quartermaster Captain James A. Eakin the task of converting the camp from a training camp to a prisoner of war facility. Eakin oversaw the conversion of livestock stalls into barracks, the installation of a wooden stockade wall around the camp. Workers installed entry gates, guard towers, and sentry walkways. Workers also installed latrines. 5 wells provided water. Work had not completed on the camp when the first trains arrived on February the 22nd, 1862, with the first prisoners. The prisoner population increased to over 4,000 prisoners by April. The Army took over administration of the camp with the arrival of the first prisoners. The camp remained crowded until August 1862, when the Union and Confederate armies completed a general prisoner exchange. Camp Morton again became a training camp. By early 1863, there was again a need for a prisoner of war camp, and the Army converted the facility again. The last prisoners were paroled on June the 12th, 1865. During its operation, the camp housed an average of 3,214, with a maximum of 4,900 during July 1864. The deaths at the camp totaled around 1,700, or about 50 men a month. The dead soldiers were interred at Crown Hill Cemetery. After the war, the The grounds reverted to the Indiana State Fairgrounds, which used the site until 1891. The Camp Morton site has since been platted and used as a residential neighborhood known as Morton's Place. President Lincoln's speech during his inaugural journey to Washington, D.C. is immortalized by this marker on Washington Street. Title of the marker, Lincoln to the Citizens of Indiana. Location, 402 West Washington Street at Missouri Street in Indianapolis, Indiana. Marker text, quote, "It is your business if the union of these states and the liberties of this people shall be lost. It is your business to rise up and preserve the union." Unquote, from the speech by President-elect Abraham Lincoln at the intersection of Washington and Missouri Streets in Indianapolis on February the 11th, 1861. President-elect Abraham Lincoln departed his home in Springfield, Illinois on February the 11th, 1861 to travel by train to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration as President of the United States. His first stop was at State Line, Indiana to give a speech. There's another historical marker located at Virginia Avenue that honors the 28th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. Title of the marker, 28th Regiment, USCT, location, Virginia Avenue and McCarty Street, Indianapolis, Indiana, in Marion County. Marker text, Side 1, Indiana's only African American Civil War regiment served as part of the 28th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops. African American infantry was authorized in 1863 to help fill the federal quota for soldiers. The Reverend Willis Revels was a recruiting officer. Recruits trained at Camp Fremont, established on land near here owned by Calvin Fletcher. Side 2. In April 1864, 6 companies were organized and activated. The 28th Regiment served valiantly in the Battle of Crater at Pittsburgh, Virginia on July the 30th, 1864, when nearly half of its men were killed or wounded. The 28th returned to Indianapolis on January the 6th, 1866, to a reception in its honor. Officer and men were discharged on January the 9th. Prior to 1863, recruiting of black men to fight was rare, and many times black men wishing to enlist were refused. The reason to refuse them dated from a federal law passed in 1792 that banned Negroes from bearing arms for the armed forces. However, after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January the 1st, 1863, the war became a tool to vanquish slavery instead of a cudgel to force the South back into the Union. Additionally, as the war churned on, recruitment of soldiers to fight became more difficult, and many states had trouble filling their quotas. Indiana Governor Oliver P. Morton faced a dilemma. Recruitment was lagging, and he needed something to spur enlistments. The largest problem was political. Many residents in southern Indiana had originally emigrated from Virginia and Kentucky and were pro-slavery. If he allowed black men to enlist and fight, he risked losing support for the war in that region. On July the 17th, 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation and Militia Act. The act freed slaves owned by officers serving in the Confederate Army. On May the 22nd, 1863, the Army issued General Order 143, which created the United States Colored Troops. The United States Department of War authorized the only black troops from Indiana that would serve during the American Civil War on November 30th, 1863. Enlistments began on December the 3rd, 1863, and moved to a training camp on the south side of Indianapolis called Camp Fremont in honor of 1856 Republican presidential candidate John C. Fremont, the Republican Party's first Republican nominee for president. The regiment's commanding officer was Charles S. Russell. The regiment left Indiana on April the 24th, 1864 for Washington, D.C., and then on to Alexandria, Virginia for additional training. On June the 21st, the 28th engaged in its first battle at White House, Virginia. General Sherman took the unit along with his march through the Chickahominy Swamp. During this campaign, the unit suffered heavy casualties. It participated in the sieges of Richmond and Pittsburgh in Virginia. It lost almost half its soldiers to death and wounding at the Battle of the Crater in Virginia. After reinforcement and enlargement to a full regiment, the unit marched into Richmond, Virginia on April the 4th, 1865. At war's end, the Army deployed the regiment to Brazos, Santiago, and Corpus Christi, Texas, to deal with unrest there. The regiment mustered out on November the 8th, 1865. It returned to Indianapolis on January the 8th, 1866, to a reception held in its honor. Organized in Indianapolis with companies from Marion, Montgomery, Orange, Jackson, Park, Jefferson, Wayne, Vandenberg, Knox, Clark, Posey, Jennings, Jackson, Jay, and Howard counties. The regiment mustered into action on April the 20th, 1864, with Colonel Charles S. Russell in command. Major actions included Battle of the Crater, July the 30th, 1864. During this battle, nearly half of its soldiers were killed or wounded. The regiment was replenished with more recruits from Indiana and served the remainder of the conflict fighting in Virginia. The regiment mustered out of action on November the 8th, 1865, after suffering 212 casualties, 47 killed in action, and the rest a disease. In Montgomery County, we find a historic marker that honors Crawfordville native war general, General Lew Wallace. Title of the marker, Major General Lew Wallace, 1827 through 1905. Location, 501 Park Street and Wallace Avenue, Crawfordsville. Text, as Indiana's adjutant general, he organized the state for war. He saw action at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Monaskasee. Later, he served as governor of New Mexico Territory and minister to Turkey. Author of the book Ben-Hur. Lew Wallace lived from April the 10th, 1827 through February the 15th, 1905. The second of four sons born to David Wallace and Esther French Test Wallace, Lew was a native of Brookville, Indiana. The family moved to Covington, Indiana in 1834, where Esther Wallace died of tuberculosis. Lewis displayed a talent for drawing. He attended public schools, but his discipline problem caused his father to send him to Wabash Preparatory School. He later attended a private academy at Centerville, Indiana. His teacher inherited his talent for writing while he was there. After graduating, he wrote his first novel, The Fair God, published in 1873. He began studying law, but the Mexican War broke out, and he enlisted in the 1st Indiana Volunteer Infantry as a second lieutenant. Before mustering out in 1847, he received a promotion to first lieutenant. After the war, Wallace gained admittance to the Indiana bar. He first established a practice at Covington, where he gained election to the Indiana House of Representatives. He later gained election to the Indiana Senate. During his time in Crawfordsville, he also formed the Montgomery Guards, which would become the central unit of the 11th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, which he commanded later during the Civil War. When war broke out in 1861, Governor Oliver Morton asked Wallace to become the adjutant general and organized Camp Morton to receive Union Army volunteers. Wallace accepted the post on condition that Morton could appoint him a command after the camp was organized. 12 days later, the first recruits began arriving, and Morton accepted Wallace's resignation as adjutant general and appointed him to command the 11th Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Wallace served with General Ulysses S. Grant at the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. After Fort Donelson, Lincoln approved his appointment as a major general. His unit was involved in the Battle of Shiloh, but controversy during the battle stymied his career and proved a frustration during the rest of his life. During a mix-up in command, Wallace's unit failed to engage the Confederates at a key time, resulting in massive casualties. Grant blamed Wallace for the confusion, hurting his reputation and career in the military. Wallace later performed admirably at the Battle of Monaskasee in 1864. He also participated in the defense of Cincinnati and helped repulse an attack on a railroad junction during Morgan's raid in 1863 raid into Indiana. After the war, President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed him governor of the New Mexico Territory. President James Garfield appointed him as a U.S. minister to the Ottoman Empire in 1881. He remained at that post until 1885. During his stint as New Mexico Territorial Governor, Wallace finished the novel Ben-Hur, which saw publication in 1880. It became a bestseller, assuring financial security for Wallace and his family. He died in November 1905, and his Crawfordsville home was interred in Crawfordsville Oak Hill Cemetery. This historical marker in Kendallville in Noble County serves as location of the Civil War training camp, Camp Mitchell. Title of the marker, Camp Mitchell. Location, Orchard and Rush Street, Kendallville. Marker text, Civil War training camp for the 10th Congressional District was located at Kendallville. The 12th Indiana Cavalry and the 129th Volunteer Infantry were organized and trained here. Organized at Kendallville, Indiana on November the 10th, 1863. The 12th Indiana Cavalry mustered out on November the 10th, 1865. Again, I'll cover the history of this regiment as well as many other ones, actually all of the Indiana regiments, and the podcasts that deal with the regiments of the military. In Owen County, a Civil War training camp operated at a site noted by this marker at State Road 67 and 7th Street
This is
in
the fourth of
Gosport,
several
Indiana.
podcasts that will deal with the
Marker
Civil War
text,
historical
Civil
markers
War
in
training
Indiana.
camp for the
This week
59th
we
Indiana
visit Jennings,
Volunteers
Laporte,
in
Marion,
1861
Montgomery,
through
Noble, and
1862
Owen Counties.
was located one
Markers
mile
include
southwest
various
of
Civil War
Gosport
training
on the
camps,
White River,
Indiana's
named for
Civil
former
War
Indiana
governor,
congressman
and some
James
famous generals
Hughes.
native to the state.
The
We start
59th
in
Indiana
Jennings County.
Volunteer
This
Infantry used
historic
this
marker
camp at the intersection
Vernon
of Indiana State Road
notes an
67
incident that
and
occurred
7th
during
Street
Morgan's
in
raid.
Gosport,
Title of the
Indiana, to
marker,
train for
Morgan's
service
raid.
during the Civil
Location,
War. The
Southwest
regiment
corner
used
of
Camp
Courthouse
Hughes from
Square,
September
Vernon, Jennings
1861
County, Indiana.
until February the
Marker text.
13th,
During the Civil
1862,
War,
when the unit
Confederate
departed
General
New Albany.
John Hunt
Indiana.
Morgan led a
From
raid
New
into
Albany, the
southern
59th
Indiana,
marched off
July
to
the
war.
8th through the 13th,
Researchers have discovered that
1863.
8 of the 12
On
men
July
that died in
11th,
the
he
camp
demanded
may
the
be
surrender
interred
of
in the
Vernon.
former training
Colonel
camp. The
Hugh
men
T.
apparently
Williams,
died of a measles
Indiana Legion,
outbreak.
replied that,
Ben
quote,
Harrison Camp arranged
Morgan
to
must
have a
take it by
plaque
hard
placed on the
fighting,
site with the names of the 12
No
men
major
thought to be
battle
interred
occurred, and
in
Morgan's
the former
cavalry
camp. The group installed the plaque at a ceremony on May the 10th, 2008. Find out more about Indiana's role in the Civil War by purchasing the book, Indiana's Role in the Civil War. You can find it on my website, www.mossyfeet.com, on the Indiana Short History Series category. There are links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, and other online booksellers. You may choose to purchase the book in ebook or softbound versions. An audiobook version is available on Google Play. At the conclusion of this series, I will compile these episodes into an audiobook. The audiobook will be available on Audible, Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, as well as many other audiobook sellers. You can listen to this podcast on many platforms, including Apple, TuneIn, Spotify, Amazon Music, and many others. Video versions are available on YouTube and Rumble. You can also find my book at the Walnut Street Variety Shop in Batesville, Indiana, at 111 George Street. You can order the books direct from me off the website. And if you wish me to sign the book, just send me an email to mossyfeetbooks@gmail.com requesting a signed book and instructions on how you want me to address it. Note, if you send me an email, I will add you to my contact list. Readers on the list will receive an email from me announcing when I publish a new book. If you do not want me to add you to the list, tell me and I will not add you. Listeners to this podcast that want email notifications on my new releases can just send an email requesting addition to the list. You can choose to have your name removed at any time. If you browse the website, you will find dozens of sample chapters, one for each of my books. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and thank you for listening.